deepest suffering recorded in ancient religious history is not accidental, and it is not collateral damage. It is structurally built into how certain gods are described, defined, and obeyed. The most disturbing data point is this: entire populations were conditioned to interpret annihilation, famine, terror, and inherited punishment as proof that reality was functioning correctly. That is not a philosophical claim. That is what the text itself records. Start with comparative context, not belief. In the ancient Levant, gods were not abstract moral ideals. They were territorial powers. A god proved legitimacy by winning wars, expanding land, securing borders, and eliminating rivals. That framework matters, because once you see it, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Yahweh appears in this exact ecosystem. His profile lines up with known war deities documented across the region. Victory equals righteousness. Defeat equals abandonment. Morality follows power, not the other way around. Take the Ugaritic corpus, including Epos Baal. Baal's authority is established through combat, domination, and the defeat of rival cosmic forces. Order is achieved through violence. Stability is secured by destruction. This is not an outlier. This is the operating system of the age. Now compare that structure to Yahweh's earliest biblical portrayal. The overlap is not subtle. Yahweh is introduced not as a universal ethical principle, but as a national patron deity. He fights for territory. He commands armies. He demands exclusive loyalty. He reacts with rage when rival worship appears. He promises prosperity only through submission. These are not later distortions. These are foundational traits. The texts do not hide them. They present them as virtues. Here is the part people are rarely allowed to confront directly. In this framework, human suffering is not tragic, it is functional. Fear maintains obedience. Violence establishes hierarchy. Trauma becomes proof of authority. Entire communities are disciplined not through persuasion, but through spectacle. When cities are erased, the message is clear: survival is conditional. This is where the deepest human anxiety enters the story. If the God who controls land, food, fertility, and survival is a warlord deity, then safety comes only through alignment, not goodness. That produces a religious psychology rooted in terror, not trust. The fear is not that humans will do evil, but that they will displease power. That distinction is not minor. It determines how morality is built. The text repeatedly reinforces this system. Loyalty is rewarded with dominance. Doubt is punished with obliteration. Neutrality does not exist. You are either inside the protection zone or marked as an enemy. This is not spiritual abstraction. This is ancient geopolitical logic, written in theological language. What makes this explosive is not that Yahweh resembles other war gods. It's that later tradition insists he does not. The mythology is retrofitted to appear timeless, universal, and morally supreme, while its original structure remains intact beneath the surface. That is the sleight of hand. The attributes of a Bronze Age territorial god are preserved, but the context that explains them is stripped away. In the conquest texts, destruction is not excess. It is instruction. The Hebrew term eram does not mean defeat. It means removal from existence. No prisoners. No assimilation. No mercy clauses hiding in the footnotes. This is not war as tragedy. This is war as ritual compliance. Look at how the language functions. Cities are placed under the ban. That phrase isn't poetic. It's legal. Once a population is declared eram, every living thing inside that boundary becomes prohibited property. Not enemy property. Prohibited property. Killing is framed as obedience, not aggression. Refusal to kill becomes the violation. That inversion matters. In the narratives attributed to the book of Joshua, entire cities are wiped out after surrender or minimal resistance. Jericho serves as the template, the walls fall, the population is exterminated. The text does not present this as a moral struggle. There is no hesitation. There is no debate. The only conflict introduced concerns what happens when the rules are not followed with absolute precision. One man spares forbidden goods, and the resulting punishment is collective. Families die because the total destruction was incomplete. That is the system revealing itself. The central anxiety of the text is not bloodshed, it is disobedience. Move to Deuteronomy, and the logic becomes even more explicit. The instruction is clear: do not leave anything alive that breathes. The justification given is contamination. Other populations are framed as existential threats not because of their military power, but because of cultural and religious difference. Coexistence is forbidden. Integration is forbidden. Even pity is portrayed as a danger. The command is preventive annihilation. This is where people get uncomfortable, because the text does not hide behind metaphor. It does not say drive out influence or defeat ideology. It names children. It names infants. It names animals. The scope is biological. This is not symbolic cleansing. It is demographic elimination. Now here's the part that tends to get glossed over: the violence is time-limited but principle-based. The text does not argue that killing is always good. It argues that killing is good when commanded. That distinction is crucial because it removes morality from human judgment entirely. Ethics are no longer about harm. They are about authorization. Notice how often the narrative pauses to say Yahweh commanded. That phrase isn't storytelling flavor. It's insulation. It separates the act from responsibility. The more severe the violence, the more frequently the text insists on divine authorship. That repetition is not devotional. It's defensive. This creates a structure where genocide is not just permitted but required to prove loyalty. Partial obedience is treated as rebellion. Mercy becomes disobedience. Restraint becomes threat. The system does not allow gradients. It's total compliance or total failure. And when modern readers are told that this violence was necessary, justified, or contextually moral, that's not coming from the text. The text never argues necessity. It never debates alternatives. It assumes authority. The command exists. The violence follows. The outcome is validated by success. That's it. Now strip away conquest and look at something colder: punishment narratives where war is no longer the setting. This is where the claim that violence is merely circumstantial collapses. In the plague cycle of Exodus, violence functions as demonstration, not defense. The targets are not invading armies. They are civilians, livestock, crops, infrastructure, and firstborn children inside their homes. The text is explicit about both scope and intent. Here is the uncontestable fact: the escalation of suffering is not driven by human choice alone. The narrative repeatedly states that Yahweh hardens Pharaoh's heart. That is not poetic phrasing. It is causal attribution. Resistance is engineered so that punishment can intensify. If you remove that detail, the story loses coherence. The plagues do not exist to end oppression quickly. They exist to multiply displays of power. Look at the sequence. Water becomes blood. Food collapses. Disease spreads through animals. Boils erupt on human bodies. Weather weaponizes itself. Darkness suffocates daily function. Then the climax: selective infanticide. Firstborns die regardless of individual guilt. Status does not protect. Behavior does not protect. Only marked obedience does. That is not justice. That is control through terror signaling. And notice something people rarely sit with long enough: Pharaoh repeatedly offers partial compliance. Labor relief. Negotiation. Staged release. These are rejected. Why? Because the structure is not built to accept compromise. Total submission is required so that victory can be framed as absolute. Partial outcomes dilute authority. The language consistently emphasizes spectacle, so that they may know. That phrase shows up again and again. Knowing here does not mean understanding ethics. It means recognizing supremacy. Knowledge is achieved through devastation. The audience is not just Egypt. It is Israel. The lesson is internal. This power cannot be resisted, bargained with, or outgrown. Then there's the legal aftermath. Immediately following liberation, the narrative pivots into lawgiving, and the enforcement model is already established. Disobedience results in death. Not exile. Not reform. Death. Golden calf episode. Complaints about food. Ritual error. The response is lethal every time. There is no developmental curve. The system launches fully armed. This matters because it disproves the claim that these texts portray a patient moral guide who gradually educates humanity. The God presented here already knows what he wants and enforces it violently from page 1. There is no learning arc. Only obedience testing. Another buried detail, violence is frequently collective. Individuals act, but communities suffer. Thousands die because of the actions of a few. The text does not treat this as regrettable. It treats it as instructional. Collective punishment maintains internal cohesion through fear. Everyone becomes accountable for everyone else's compliance. And let's be clear about something else, repentance does not reliably stop punishment. In several episodes, pleas are ignored or only temporarily delay destruction. That removes the idea that punishment exists to correct behavior. If correction were the goal, proportionality and feedback would matter. What matters instead is reaffirming hierarchy. This is where modern defenses usually step in and say, "That's ancient language," or "That's metaphorical." But the narratives are extremely precise about physical outcomes. Bodies fall. Fire consumes. Earth opens. This is not symbolic abstraction. It is logistical reporting. And the biggest misdirection is calling this justice. Justice requires standards applied consistently across agents. Here, standards shift based on proximity to authority. The same act punished in the population is rewarded when performed by command. The plagues are framed as righteous, but identical acts by humans would be condemned as atrocity. This creates a model where violence is moral if it flows downward from authority and immoral if it flows upward. That is not moral philosophy. That is power mechanics. If you're still thinking this is about freeing slaves, ask a harder question. Why does liberation require the death of children who had no agency? The text answers that by not answering it. The deaths are not justified. They are normalized. What you're witnessing in these narratives is the encoding of fear as a theological virtue, or is produced through destruction. Loyalty is enforced through memory of pain. Identity is shaped by survival under threat. The exclusivity demand is not peripheral to this system. It is operational. The text does not introduce Yahweh as one option among many. It introduces him as intolerant of alternatives, hostile to rivals, and punitive toward deviation. This is not inferred later. It is legislated early and enforced violently. The first formal articulation appears in the 10 Commandments, and it's blunt. No other gods. No substitutes. No images. No dilution. The text does not argue why. It does not persuade. It asserts. The authority is self-referential, obedience is required because the speaker demands it. That matters because the same structure governs the punishment that follows. There is no appeal process. Violation equals consequence. The often repeated phrase "jealous God" is usually softened in later interpretation, as if jealousy here means care or relational passion. That is not how jealousy functions in these texts. Jealousy is territorial enforcement. It signals ownership. In ancient political terms, it's the language of a ruler protecting exclusive rights over land and population. Worship is not affection. It's allegiance. And the penalties for misaligned allegiance are not abstract. They are spelled out. Collective suffering, destruction of property, loss of fertility, extended punishment across generations. The text repeatedly states that consequences are inherited, not isolated. That is not symbolic. That is legal continuity. Children bear the cost of ancestral non-compliance, regardless of personal action. The system does not prioritize individual responsibility. It prioritizes systemic loyalty. This is where the big misdirection happens. Later readers are trained to read these passages through a moralized lens. But the original framework is administrative. Yahweh's primary concern is not ethical development. It is control of worship channels. That's why rival cults are treated as existential threats. Not competitors. Threats. Look at how the text treats foreign religious practices. There is no tolerance clause. There is no coexistence model. There is only eradication. Sacred objects are smashed. Priests are executed. Sanctuaries are burned. And again, the justification is not moral corruption. It is contamination. Contact itself is dangerous. Exposure equals betrayal. This obsession with purity is not spiritual fragility. It is strategy. If worship can be shared, loyalty weakens. If loyalty weakens, authority fractures. The text responds by eliminating options. Monotheism here is not philosophical abstraction. It is enforced monopoly. And the enforcement is relentless. The narrative tracks cycles where alternative worship appears internally, not just externally. Golden calves. Household idols. Syncretistic rituals. Each time, the response escalates. Levites kill their own kin. Plagues break out internally. Leaders are publicly eliminated. The message is consistent: deviation from exclusive worship threatens collective survival. What's critical to understand is that belief is not the primary concern. Behavior is. Internal doubt is irrelevant unless it manifests externally. The enforcement mechanism targets visible allegiance markers, sacrifice, ritual, shrine participation. Control the practices, and belief will follow. This is not theological subtlety. This is governance. The prophets reinforce this structure, not dismantle it. In Isaiah, denunciations of rival worship are fused with threats of national destruction. Cities leveled. Populations displaced. Infrastructure ruined. The cause is not injustice alone. It is unfaithfulness. The punishment is not proportional. It is totalizing. And notice how often political disaster is attributed to insufficient exclusivity rather than strategic failure. Military loss becomes a religious crime. Economic collapse becomes ritual error. Environmental catastrophe becomes proof of divine displeasure. This reframing protects the authority structure from accountability. If defeat occurs, it's not because leadership failed. It's because loyalty wasn't pure enough. That maneuver is one of the most effective control mechanisms ever written. Once suffering is tied to insufficient devotion, the solution is always more submission. Never critique. Never reform the system. Double down. This is why the text treats pluralism as chaos. Multiple gods mean multiple loyalties. Multiple loyalties mean fractured obedience. Fractured obedience threatens centralized authority. So plurality is criminalized. Not debated. Criminalized. The command to destroy rival altars is one of the clearest examples. Altars are not abstract beliefs. They are physical infrastructure. Destroying them eliminates alternatives physically, not just ideologically. It's supply chain control. Remove access points, and the population has nowhere else to go. And the punishments do not discriminate between intent and accident. Contact alone is culpable. Touch the wrong object. Approach the wrong space. Speak against the wrong authority. The response is lethal. Not corrective. Lethal. That tells you everything about the system's priorities. Later theological defenses often claim this exclusivity protected people from moral corruption. But the text itself never argues that way. It argues powerfully and repeatedly that exclusivity protects Yahweh's status. Worship is framed as owed, not chosen. Deviance is theft, not disagreement. One of the clearest indicators of this is how worship is framed economically. Offerings are described as provisions. Sacrifices as pleasing aroma. Devotion has transactional language attached to it. Loyalty produces blessing. Disloyalty produces loss. This is not mystical communion. It is covenantal contract enforced by penalties. And those penalties scale upward rapidly. A single idol can doom a village. A tolerated shrine can doom a nation. There is no statute of limitations. There is no diminishing return. The system demands constant surveillance and self-policing. What you've seen so far, war commands, spectacle punishment, inherited guilt, enforced exclusivity, are not random features stacked together. They form a coherent model that already existed long before these texts were compiled. The deception is not that Yahweh behaves violently. The deception is that this behavior was later reframed as morally transcendent rather than historically specific. In the ancient Near East, gods were judged by output, not by character. A god's worth was measured by land gained, enemies crushed, famine prevented, borders secured. This is not theology. It's political reality dressed in sacred language. Within that system, a good god was one who won. A losing god lost worshippers. Survival depended on alignment with power. That is the background these texts are written into, not an exception carved out from it. This is why Yahweh's profile aligns so cleanly with the war god template found across Levantine religion. Take the structure, not the name. A national deity emerges. He binds himself to a people. He demands exclusive allegiance. He proves himself through military success. He punishes internal defection more harshly than external enemies. He reframes loss as ritual failure rather than strategic miscalculation. That blueprint shows up repeatedly, including in texts like the Epos Ball, where divine authority is stabilized through combat, threat, and elimination of rivals. Victory equals legitimacy. Control equals divinity. What's critical is that Yahweh is not presented as competing within this system and failing. He is succeeding within it. The conquest narratives, the punitive laws, the jealousy doctrine, they all function perfectly within a war deity economy. They are not distortions. They are confirmations. The later theological move is where the sleight of hand happens. Once Israel survives longer than surrounding cultures, once texts are canonized, once exile forces reinterpretation, the old structure is preserved but rebranded. Historical violence is reframed as divine mystery. Political loyalty becomes moral righteousness. Territorial dominance becomes cosmic sovereignty. The God does not change roles. The explanation does. And here is the buried mechanism that almost no one points out directly. When a God is defined as the ultimate good by definition, all actions become justified retroactively. Killing becomes justice. Jealousy becomes holiness. Punishment becomes love. The system closes in on itself. There is no external standard left to evaluate behavior. Power certifies itself. This is why comparison is so dangerous to the narrative. If Yahweh is placed back alongside other ancient deities instead of above them, the uniqueness claim weakens. Not because the texts disappear, but because the behaviors stop looking exceptional. They look expected. Texts that were never shy about divine violence suddenly read like standard issue for their time. And let's be precise, this isn't about saying everyone was bad back then. That's a dodge. The point is that the morality of the system is aligned with domination, not compassion. The highest virtue is loyalty. The highest sin is defection. Everything else flows from that hierarchy. This also explains why moral inconsistency inside the text is never resolved, only asserted away. Mercy and massacre coexist without apology. Kindness is praised in principle, overridden in practice. The system doesn't collapse under contradiction because it doesn't run on coherence. It runs on command. If authority speaks, coherence is irrelevant. Another part people are rarely encouraged to analyze is scale. Local deities punished locally. Yahweh punishes nationally and generationally. That expansion mirrors political centralization. The God grows as the state ideology grows. Divine authority expands to match administrative control. This isn't speculation. It's visible in how penalties become broader, more abstract, more enduring. And when modern theology insists this God is fundamentally different from all others, that insistence relies on selective reading. Passages that align with ethical ideals are elevated. Passages that reveal raw power mechanics are reframed, sidelined, or declared incomprehensible. The violence is never denied. It's anesthetized. That anesthetization is the real legacy. Not the ancient texts themselves, which are brutally honest about what they describe, but the later insistence that we must not read them plainly. That plain reading threatens the idea that this God stands outside history instead of being embedded in it. Once you strip away the insulation, the pattern becomes unmistakable. A war god, operating in a war god world, behaving exactly as war gods behave, later declared morally absolute through theological elevation rather than behavioral transformation. The difference is not in the actions. It's in the story told about them afterward. And that is why this topic triggers such intense emotional pushback. The problem isn't that these facts aren't there. The problem is that they destabilize a story many people were told never to question. They reclassify obedience as survival strategy, worship as allegiance, and holiness as sanctioned power. None of this requires exaggeration. None of it requires hostile interpretation. It only requires refusing to look away. Thank you sincerely to everyone who stayed with this all the way to the end and engaged with the material.